I've been using the Headrush MX5 multi-effects pedal pretty regularly for about 9 months now, so I thought maybe I should make a review of it. But as soon as I thought of that, I found out that Headrush had discontinued the MX5. So is it still worthwhile for me to make a review? I think it is, because this review is not going to be only about the MX5 specifically. It's really about the entire Headrush effects lineup, which are all pretty similar in a lot of ways, and Headrush as a company and my experiences with them. From the title of the video, you might think it's going to be a negative review, which is not really the case. I really like the MX5. It does pretty much everything I need, and it was the only pedal I could find at the time that did everything I was looking for. Headrush's products are very powerful. They do a lot for a reasonable price. Also, some of the flaws I'll be telling you about have been fixed in their newer products. Although unfortunately, since the MX5 is now considered a legacy product, they're not going to be updating its firmware anymore, which is pretty annoying given that their website advertised it as new as recently as August of last year. It was actually 2 years old at the time, but still that means they stopped supporting it just 3 years after introducing it. Now, you should know that I'm not a typical user of a guitar effects processor because I'm not a guitarist. I'm a cellist. I often play with a bridge pickup, but I usually want it to sound like an acoustic cello. I play in a band that mostly does acoustic covers of 1980s songs.
For a good time come!
The biggest reason I bought the MX5 was that you can make a bridge pickup sound a lot more like an acoustic instrument by applying an impulse response from an acoustic instrument. I bought a cello impulse response from 3 Sigma Audio for $15, and it's great. Here's what my pickup sounds like without the impulse response. And here's what it sounds like with the impulse response. So much better. There are cheaper pedals that just do impulse responses, but I wanted an all-in-one unit with a lot of power and flexibility. Previously, I was using this Digitech RP255 pedal, which I bought for $150 in 2009. I used it for 15 years. It was great, it still works, but it doesn't do third-party impulse responses, so I decided it was time to upgrade. The Headrush, of course, is better in almost every way, not quite, as we'll see later. So what was I looking for? I wanted all the usual effects that come standard in this kind of thing. I wanted a built-in expression pedal, so I wouldn't have to deal with an extra device and cables. And I thought it would be cool to have a decent looper. This was the feature that was missing in basically all of the competing products. They have loopers, but the loop length is limited to something like 20 seconds, maybe 40 in mono. When I mess around with looping, I usually find I want closer to a minute. Come on guys, memory is cheap. The Headrush can go up to 5 minutes. Other things I like: the small size is great. It really fits nicely in the briefcase that I use when I'm carrying my cello around on public transportation. In fact, the form factor is practically perfect for my needs, except that I wish the expression pedal was a bit lower to the ground like it is on the Digitech. The height of the pedal raises my knee, which is annoying since I hold the cello with my knees, and it can get in the way of the bow if I'm not careful. So here are things I don't like. There's no mobile or desktop editor app. They just finally released one for their newer devices, the Prime, the Core, and the replacement for the MX5, which they call the Flex Prime, but they're not going to add it to the older devices. Headrush products seem to have a higher latency than some effects pedals. To be clear, I'm talking about the time between when a sound goes in the guitar input jack and when it comes out the main outputs. It has nothing to do with using the pedal as a USB audio interface for your computer, and nothing to do with how fast it responds to the foot switches. I'm just talking about the delay it adds to your live performance. Now, I don't think this is terribly important for my purposes. I measured the latency at 5.5 milliseconds with no effects in the chain, which really is totally fine, especially for cello. I think it's fine for guitar or bass as well. I wouldn't want it for drums, but no one plays drums through these things. But then the latency doubles if you use the effects loop. 11 milliseconds, probably still fine. And then some of the built-in effects also have their own latency, particularly pitch shifting. And then you have to add on any other effect you're using outside of the pedal. If you use a wireless transmitter, that'll add some latency. And there's the time for the sound to travel from the speakers to your ears. It all adds up, and at some point it's going to feel like something is wrong even if you don't consciously perceive it as a delay. So that's why I think 1 or 2 milliseconds of latency would be better than 5 or 6, even if 6 is totally fine on its own. Leo Gibson tested 23 amp modeling pedals in 2022, and most were better than the Headrush. I'll put a link to his video in the description below. By the way, my old Digitech pedal was 1 millisecond. I'm guessing that's because it uses a dedicated signal processing chip. All of Headrush's pedals use an ARM CPU like the one in your cell phone, both for sound processing and to run the user interface, which is based on Linux. So I assume they have to add some extra buffering in case the sound processing gets interrupted and falls behind. But that's probably also how they were able to include so much sound processing power, plus a sophisticated touchscreen interface at a reasonable price. Next problem. Most of the effects are good, but I've been disappointed in the pitch shifting effects. The tracking is often slow and unreliable. I wasn't able to use the octave effect with my cello because it seems to only work down to the low E string of a guitar. I ended up using an effect they call pitch delay, which inserts a delay along with the pitch shifting, but you can set it to 1 millisecond, so it's not really noticeable. The Smart Harmonizer effect also has fairly poor tracking, but it also doesn't implement the scales correctly. They seem to have confused harmonic minor with melodic minor, and it's not really melodic minor, it's just minor with raised 6th and 7th. In major and natural minor, if you set it to shift by a third, it works, but if you shift by a 4th or 5th, it just always uses a perfect 4th or 5th instead of staying in the scale. And then they have a bunch of pentatonic scales and whole tone scales and things that don't even seem to be scales. They just shift by a constant interval no matter what you do. And it doesn't have customizable scales like some other companies do. When you're tweaking an effect like a compressor or distortion, there's no way to see how close you are to saturation. Usually a compressor will have meters to show the input level and how much it's compressing, but there's nothing like that here. You also get no visualization of what the EQ curve is like when you're using parametric EQ, something I'm used to having in my software when I'm recording. The MIDI implementation honestly kind of sucks. It can respond to program changes and a few controller changes, but there's no message to go to the next patch or the previous one, and there's no way to change the set list. The only messages it can send are program changes. Also, for some of the controller changes it does support, like starting the looper, you have to send 2 messages to do one thing, which is completely undocumented. I had to figure it out by trial and error. If you only send one message, the whole user interface basically stops working. Users have been requesting MIDI improvements for years, and it's the easiest kind of thing to fix in firmware, but Headrush doesn't seem to have noticed. A huge flaw, I think, is the documentation. You get a manual which explains general functionality, but there's no list of the effects. There's nothing that tells you what the parameters in each effect mean. This is a standard thing I've seen in all the other effects units I've used, I think. And in general, communication from Headrush has not been very good. They run this forum where you can submit bug reports or feature requests or ask questions, but it's rare for an actual Headrush employee to answer. For a bug report, they'll often acknowledge it and say that they're investigating, but they almost never update you on the status after that, and the chances of it getting fixed seem pretty small. Other users are sometimes pretty helpful though, and as far as I know, Headrush does respond to tech support requests. Firmware updates have been pretty infrequent. I bought mine in February. There was one update this summer, which was something like a year after the previous update, and then in November they said it was discontinued and there won't be any more updates. So some of the issues, but not all of them, have been fixed in the new Flex Prime, which is the replacement for the MX5. It looks exactly like an MX5 on the outside, but on the inside, it's more like their other newer models, the Prime and the Core. It can do everything those can do as far as guitar effects. It just doesn't have the vocal processing abilities, and it can't clone amps or effects itself, although it can use cloned amps and effects that have been made on the Prime or Core, and they also give you desktop software that can do it. It also has Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, and it supports their new patch editor software that runs in the browser or on your computer or tablet or phone. I don't have any intention of upgrading to the Flex Prime because, as I said, I'm really fairly happy with the MX5. If I hadn't bought it already, there's a good chance I would buy the Flex Prime. On the other hand, there's a few new competitors out there, like the Boss GX10, which I think I would have to consider, although it does have a really short limit on the length of loops. But as long as my needs don't change much, I might end up using the MX5 for another 15 years, unless it breaks. We'll have to see. Big thanks to the other users on the Headrush forum who have helped me, the other YouTube reviewers that I referenced above, Tony McKenzie and Leo Gibson, and of course to Headrush for making what I still think is a pretty good product.
And to you for watching.